The air in the event hall was thick and warm, smelling of cheap perfume, stale beer, and the faint, greasy scent of mini quiche warming under a heat lamp. It was the company's annual summer party, an event everyone felt obligated to attend but few genuinely enjoyed. A bad DJ was playing music from a decade ago, the thumping bass doing little to cover the nervous chatter of 100 colleagues trying too hard to have fun. Colorful streamers, already looking a bit sad, drooped from the ceiling, and the lights were dimmed just enough to make everyone look a little better, and a little less like themselves. In the middle of it all, holding court near the makeshift bar, was David. He wasn't a manager or anyone particularly important, but he had a loud laugh and an even louder personality that made him the center of gravity in any room. He wore a brightly colored tie, completely undone, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows as he told a story, his hands flying through the air for emphasis. A small crowd had gathered around him, hanging on his every word, their laughter punctuating his tale. He was the king of the office joke, the guy who could lighten up a boring Monday meeting with a well-timed quip. Most people liked him, even if they sometimes found his attention seeking a bit much. He just had this energy, this need to be on, to be performing. To him, life was a stage, and every interaction was a chance to get a laugh. His eyes, constantly scanning the room for his next audience member, drifted past the usual groups. There were the tech guys huddled in a corner, arguing about something no one else understood. There were the sales team, a loud, boisterous cluster already several drinks in, and then his gaze landed on her, Clara. She was standing alone, as she often did, near the buffet table. She was nursing a glass of water, her posture slightly hunched, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. She wore a simple, dark blue dress that was nice but didn't draw any attention. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she watched the party unfold with the quiet, observant eyes of someone who was used to being on the outside looking in. She was a ghost at her own party, and in David's mind, she was the perfect target. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. He excused himself from his adoring crowd and made a beeline for the small stage at the front of the room, where the DJ was looking bored. David snatched the spare microphone from its stand, tapping it a few times. The screech of feedback cut through the music, making everyone wince and turn their heads toward the stage. The DJ shot him an annoyed look but didn't protest. David had that effect on people. They just let him do his thing. All right, settle down, party people." David's voice boomed through the speakers, far louder than necessary. He had that cheesy game show host voice that he thought was hilarious. A few people whooped and hollered, egging him on. "I've got a little challenge for you all. A little bit of Friday night fun?" He paused for effect, letting the anticipation build. "You know, we work with these people every single day, but do we really know them? I bet there are some hidden talents in this room." He let his eyes roam the crowd again, a predator looking for its prey. They landed back on Clara, who was now trying to discreetly move behind a large potted fern. It was too late. He had her in his sights. "For instance," he continued, his voice dripping with mock seriousness, "we have our lovely Clara from accounting." 100 heads swiveled in her direction. Clara felt a hot, prickling sensation crawl up her neck. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She shrank back further, but the fern did little to hide her. "Now, Clara is the quietest person in this entire company," David announced to the room. "She's super efficient, never makes a fuss. But I have a theory. I think behind that quiet exterior, there's a rock star just waiting to get out." The crowd chuckled, a mix of amusement and awkward sympathy. They all knew this was David's style. It was a bit mean, but it was all in good fun, right? "So, I've got a proposition for you, Clara," he said, pointing the microphone directly at her like a weapon. "See that old piano over there in the corner?" He gestured with his free hand to a dusty, forgotten-looking upright piano that was probably used as a coat rack more than anything else. "I bet you $20. No, $50. That you can't even play chopsticks on that thing?" A bigger wave of laughter rolled through the room. It was a perfect, harmless joke, poking fun at the quiet girl, challenging her to do something she clearly couldn't do. It was an easy laugh, a guaranteed win for David. He stood there on the small stage, beaming, his chest puffed out, waiting for Clara to blush, shake her head, and maybe play along with a shy smile. That's how it was supposed to go. That's how it always went. But for Clara, the world had suddenly gone silent except for the pounding of blood in her ears. The word piano hung in the air like a death sentence. It wasn't just a word. It was a key turning a lock in a room she had kept bolted shut for years. A flood of memories she had desperately tried to suppress came rushing back. The smell of wood polish, the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder, the sound of his laughter filling their small living room as she fumbled through a scale. The piano wasn't a joke to her. It was a graveyard of memories, a monument to a happiness so intense it now hurt to think about. After he was gone, she couldn't even look at a piano without feeling a hollow ache in her chest. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and mockery. She saw David's smug, expectant face, and a feeling she hadn't felt in a very long time began to stir deep inside her. It was small at first, a tiny spark in the darkness of her shame, but it grew hotter and brighter with every passing second of silence. It was anger. It was defiance. It was the part of her that was tired of being invisible, tired of being the quiet girl, the safe bet, the easy target. David saw a wallflower he could pluck for a quick laugh. He had no idea he was standing in a field of dormant seeds, about to unleash a storm. The silence in the room was becoming uncomfortable. People started shifting on their feet, the laughter dying down. David was about to say something else, to fill the awkward pause with another joke at her expense. But before he could, Clara moved. She placed her glass of water on a nearby table with a quiet, deliberate click that seemed to echo in the silent hall. She smoothed down her dress, took a slow, deep breath, and then she started to walk. Not towards the exit, as everyone expected. She walked towards the stage, and then past it. Her steps were calm and measured, her back straight, her head held high. The crowd parted for her like the sea, their amused expressions slowly melting into ones of pure, unadulterated shock. David stood frozen on the stage, the microphone still in his hand, his smile completely gone. He had no idea what was happening, but for the first time that night he wasn't in control of the joke. The joke, it seemed, was about to be on him. The walk from the edge of the crowd to the dusty corner of the hall felt like the longest journey of her life. Each step was a conscious effort, her shoes sticking slightly to the tacky floor that had been spilled on and walked over 100 times that night. The room was utterly silent now, the bad DJ having finally given up. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint, frantic thumping of her own heart, a drumbeat of panic against her ribs. 100 pairs of eyes followed her, a heavy physical weight. She could feel their collective curiosity, their confusion, and underneath it all, the lingering residue of their amusement. They were waiting for her to fail, to trip, to turn back in embarrassment. But she kept walking, her gaze fixed on the old upright piano as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea dot. As she got closer, she could see the details of the neglected instrument. It was a dark wood, probably mahogany, but the finish was dull and clouded with a fine layer of dust. One corner was chipped, revealing the lighter wood underneath like a scar. The music stand was propped up, holding a few yellowed, curling pages of sheet music for a song she didn't recognize. It looked lonely, forgotten, pushed into the corner to be out of the way. It was a prop, a piece of furniture, and in that moment Clara felt a deep, surprising kinship with it. She knew what it was like to be pushed aside, to be overlooked, to hold a beautiful purpose that no one remembered anymore. She stopped a foot away from the piano bench, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. The hesitation that had been a flicker of doubt now became a paralyzing wall. What was she doing? This was insane. She hadn't seriously touched a piano in almost 5 years. Her fingers would be stiff, her timing off. The muscle memory would be rusty, buried under years of paperwork and quiet lunches at her desk. David's stupid, drunken joke was about to become a public humiliation of her own making. She could just turn around, smile weakly, and say, "Just kidding," and the room would erupt in relieved laughter. The awkward tension would break, and she could go back to being invisible. It was the smart thing to do. The safe thing to do, but her feet wouldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the yellowed ivory keys, and as she stared, the noisy hall, the silent crowd, and David's anxious face all began to fade away. The piano was no longer just a piano in a corner. It was the piano in her childhood living room, the one her father had saved up for months to buy. It was bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight that used to stream through their window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air just like they were dancing now. She could almost smell the faint scent of lemonwood polish he used, a smell that would forever be linked to him in her mind. She saw him, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing presence. He was sitting on that very bench, his broad back to her, his shoulders swaying slightly as he played. His hands, large and calloused from his work as a mechanic, moved with an impossible grace across the keys. He could coax sounds out of that old piano that she had never heard from any other instrument. He played everything, complicated classical pieces, jaunty ragtime tunes, old blues songs he'd learned from the radio. The piano was his voice. It was how he expressed the joy, the sadness, and the love that he sometimes struggled to put into words, a memory so sharp and clear it made her ache, surfaced. She was about 10 years old, struggling with a particularly difficult passage in a sonatina. Her small fingers fumbled, hitting the wrong notes again and again. Frustrated, she had slammed her hands down on the keys, creating a jarring, discordant noise. "I can't," she had wailed, tears stinging her eyes. "It's too hard." Her father had stopped playing. He didn't get mad. He just turned to her, his eyes soft and kind. He took her small hands in his large ones, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "Hey, now," he had said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about feeling something. Don't think about the notes. Think about the story they're telling. Close your eyes. Let the piano tell the story for you." He had placed her hands back on the keys, his own hands covering hers, guiding them through the difficult passage. "There you go," he had whispered. "Just let it speak." After he was gone, the silence in the house had been the loudest sound she had ever heard. The piano stood in the living room like a tombstone. Every time she looked at it, she expected to see him sitting there. Every time she thought about touching the keys, she was overwhelmed by the ghost of his hands covering hers. The grief was a physical thing, a weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. So she closed the lid. She let the dust settle. She let the music die with him, because playing it without him felt like a betrayal, like admitting he was truly gone forever. She had packed that part of her life away, just like she had packed away his clothes, and she had built a new, quiet, safe life where loud, beautiful things couldn't hurt her anymore. And now here she was. 5 years of silence, of carefully constructed safety, all being threatened by a loud-mouthed salesman and a stupid joke. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, cut through her grief. Who was David to reduce her father's legacy, her most sacred and painful memory, to a cheap laugh? Who were these people to stand and stare, waiting for her to confirm their small-minded assumptions about her? They saw a quiet administrative assistant. They had no idea she had a universe of music and memory locked away inside her. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd. Her gaze found David near the stage. His smug grin was long gone. He looked pale, his brow furrowed with a mixture of confusion and dawning regret. He was realizing, just as she was, that this had stopped being a joke the moment she started walking. He had poked a sleeping dragon, and he was just now seeing the smoke dot. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in charge. The defiance, the memory of her father's gentle encouragement, was stronger. "Let the piano tell the story," he had said. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to let a new story be told. Not a story of grief and silence, but a story of who she was and who she had been. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and pulled the heavy bench away from the piano. It scraped softly against the floor. She sat down, the worn velvet cool and familiar beneath her. The position felt right. her body aligning with the keys in a way that was deeply ingrained in her muscle memory. She lifted her hands, hovering them over the keys for a fraction of a second. They were trembling. She took one last, deep breath, filling her lungs with the stale party air. And then she closed her eyes, shutting out the room, the people, and the past. She let her fingers gently settle on the cool ivory, and for the first time in 5 years, she was ready to listen to what the piano had to say. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own breathing, a ragged, uneven rhythm in the suffocating silence of the hall. Her fingers rested on the keys, cool and smooth beneath her touch. It felt both foreign and familiar, like a language she once knew fluently but hadn't spoken in years. A part of her brain, the rational part that filed spreadsheets and paid bills, screamed at her to stop. To stand up, walk away, and pretend this never happened. But another part, a deeper, older part, was in charge now. It was the part that remembered the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder, the pride in his eyes when she mastered a difficult piece, the way the world seemed to disappear when they played together. Then her right thumb pressed down on a single key. A note, clear and pure, hung in the air like a crystal chime. It was a simple note, but in the dead silence of the room it sounded as loud as a gunshot. A few people flinched. David, still standing near the stage, took an involuntary half-step backward. The note faded, but the space it occupied remained charged with expectation. Clara didn't move. She let that single note settle, a question posed to the silent room. Then her fingers began to move. It wasn't a song, not yet. It was a slow, thoughtful exploration, a few tentative chords that sounded like she was introducing herself to the piano again. The notes were a little dusty, a bit hesitant, like old friends reuniting after a long separation. The crowd watched, completely baffled. This wasn't the clumsy, fumbling attempt at chopsticks they had been expecting. This was something else entirely. The smirks had vanished, replaced by expressions of genuine confusion and a dawning curiosity. Then the melody began. It started softly, a gentle, flowing line of notes that wept with a quiet sadness. It was a piece by Chopin, a nocturne her father had adored, one he said sounded like staring up at the stars and feeling both incredibly small and infinitely connected to everything all at once. As the familiar tune filled the air, something shifted inside Clara. The stiffness in her shoulders melted away. The tension in her neck released. Her fingers, which had felt stiff and foreign just moments ago, suddenly remembered everything. They found their strength, their agility, their voice. Her posture changed. She was no longer hunched over the keys, trying to make herself small. Her back straightened, her head tilted slightly to the side, and her entire being seemed to lean into the instrument. Her eyes were still closed, but her face was no longer a mask of fear and hesitation. It was alive with emotion. Her brow furrowed in concentration during a complex passage. Her lips parted slightly as a particularly beautiful phrase soared through the hall. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was inhabiting them. She was telling their story. The story was one of profound loss. The music swelled with aching melancholy, each note a teardrop, each chord a sigh. It spoke of empty rooms and deafening silences, of the hollow ache that grief leaves behind. People in the crowd stopped shifting uncomfortably. They stopped looking at each other with questioning glances. Their eyes were fixed on Clara, and their faces began to change. A woman in the front row, who had been smirking with David just minutes before, now had a hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes glistening. A man leaning against the wall slowly slid down to sit on the floor, his face a picture of rapt attention. The party was over. An invisible curtain had fallen, and this forgotten corner of a stuffy event hall had been transformed into a grand concert hall. And then there was David. He stood frozen, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The microphone he had held like a trophy was now forgotten, dangling from its cord. He watched, his mouth slightly agape, as the quiet woman he had so casually mocked, for a cheap laugh, poured her soul out for everyone to see. He saw the pain in the lines of her face, the passion in the dance of her fingers. He didn't understand the music, not technically, but he understood the emotion. It was raw, it was honest, and it was devastatingly beautiful. He felt a wave of hot shame wash over him so intense it made him feel dizzy. He had wanted to expose her, to make her the butt of a joke. But he had succeeded in a way he never could have imagined. He had exposed her, yes, but he had exposed a depth and a beauty that he, and probably everyone else, had been too shallow to even imagine. He hadn't made a fool of her. He had made a fool of himself. The music began to build. The gentle melancholy evolved into a storm of sound. The notes came faster, more complex, a torrent of emotion that was no longer just sad, but angry, passionate, and full of a desperate longing. Clara's hands flew across the keys, her left hand playing powerful, rolling chords while her right hand danced a frantic, intricate ballet on the higher notes. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of a spirit fighting against the confines of grief. It was the sound of 5 years of silence being shattered in a single, explosive moment. The entire room was holding its breath, captivated by the raw power of the performance. They weren't just colleagues watching a coworker anymore. They were witnesses to a catharsis, a public exorcism of a private pain. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The torrent of notes softened, the anger receding back into that deep, haunting sadness. The final phrases of the piece were delicate and sparse, each note hanging in the air like a fragile memory before fading away. Her fingers slowed, their dance becoming a slow, weary walk. And then, with the softest touch, she played the final, resonant chord. It was a sound that seemed to contain all the sorrow and beauty of the entire piece, and it hung in the air for a long, long time before finally, completely disappearing. Silence. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than the one that had come before. It was a sacred silence, a space filled with the ghost of the music that had just been played. No one moved, no one spoke, no one clapped. They just stood there, stunned, their minds trying to process what they had just experienced. The air crackled with a shared, unspoken emotion. Clara's fingers rested on the keys, her chest rising and falling with each deep, shuddering breath. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The spell was broken. She was back in the brightly lit, stuffy event hall. She was no longer on a stage in her mind, but in a corner surrounded by 100 of her colleagues. And as she looked out at their faces, she saw that they were no longer looking at the quiet girl from accounting. They were looking at her, truly seeing her for the first time. And in their eyes she saw no mockery, only awe. The final chord faded, but its echo seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, a shimmering veil of sound that refused to disappear. The silence that followed was not an empty silence. It was a full one, heavy and dense with the emotion that had just been poured into the room. It was the kind of silence that follows a profound confession or a shared tragedy, a space where words felt useless and even breathing seemed like an intrusion. 100 people stood frozen, their glasses held halfway to their lips, their conversations forgotten mid-sentence. They were no longer a crowd of colleagues at a mandatory party. They were a congregation. And Clara was the priestess who had just delivered a sermon they never knew they needed to hear. For Clara, the world had shrunk to the small space between her fingers and the piano keys. Her hands remained on the ivory, trembling slightly from the exertion and the sudden, overwhelming release. A fine sheen of sweat coated her forehead, and her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild drum solo that was the only sound she could truly hear. The music had been a dam, holding back 5 years of grief, loneliness, and unspoken words. Now that the dam had broken, she felt raw, exposed, and terrifyingly empty. She was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes on her, but they no longer felt judgmental. They felt reverent. And that was almost harder to bear. She had wanted to be invisible, and in her attempt to prove she wasn't a joke, she had made herself more visible than ever before. The silence was finally broken by a single, soft sound. It came from the back of the room. A clap. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a tentative, almost questioning sound, like someone testing the temperature of the water before diving in. It was an older man from the mailroom, a quiet man who was often overlooked himself. He just stood there, clapping slowly, his eyes fixed on Clara with a look of deep, unutterable respect. His solitary clap was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples began to spread. Another person joined in, then another. It wasn't a wave of thunderous applause that you'd expect at a concert. It was a slow, building cascade of sound, each clap seeming to be a personal, individual response to what they had just witnessed. It was the sound of 100 people realizing they had just been in the presence of something extraordinary, something that went far beyond a simple office party. The applause grew louder, but it never lost its heartfelt, almost solemn quality. It was an ovation not just for her talent, but for her courage. The sound of it finally broke through Clara's daze. The reality of the situation came crashing down on her. She had just bared her soul in front of everyone. The vulnerability was so intense it felt like a physical pain. She snatched her hands away from the keys as if they were burning hot, and pushed the bench back with a scraping sound that was lost in the applause. She stood up on shaky legs, her vision blurring slightly at the edges. All she wanted to do was escape, to run out of the room and keep running until she found a dark, quiet place where she could be alone with the echoes of her father's music and the overwhelming weight of what she had just done. As she turned to leave, she saw him. David was making his way through the crowd, moving towards her. The sea of people parted for him, just as it had for her, but the energy was completely different. He walked with a slowness, a heaviness that was the complete opposite of his usual confident stride. His face was pale, his smug grin replaced by a look of utter humility and shock. He looked smaller, diminished. The loud, boisterous peacock had been plucked, and all that was left was a man forced to confront his own shallowness. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough for her to see the genuine remorse in his eyes. The applause was still washing over them, but it felt like it was happening in another world. For a moment he just stood there, opening and closing his mouth, searching for words that clearly weren't there. What could he possibly say? Sorry, I made a joke at your expense that accidentally led to you revealing a profound and beautiful part of your soul that I was too ignorant to see. It was absurd. Finally, he just shook his head slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor for a second before meeting her eyes again. He started, his voice barely a whisper, rough with emotion. I had no idea. It wasn't an apology, not directly. It was something more. It was an admission, a confession of his own blindness. He wasn't just sorry for the joke. He was sorry for the years of not seeing her, for reducing a complex, vibrant human being to a simple, quiet caricature in his mind. Clara looked at him. She saw the shame in his posture, the sincerity in his eyes. All the anger and defiance that had fueled her walk to the piano had drained away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. She didn't have the energy for a confrontation, nor did she want one. Holding a grudge felt like trying to cup water in her hands. So she just gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't acceptance. It was a simple acknowledgement, an acknowledgement that he saw her now. And in that moment, that was enough. The nod seemed to break the spell for both of them. David took a half-step back, giving her space, a silent gesture of respect. As she turned to walk away, a few people from the crowd tentatively approached her, not with jokes or loud comments, but with quiet, awed voices. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, one woman said, her hand on her heart. My grandmother used to play that, an older gentleman said softly, his eyes distant with memory. They weren't talking to the quiet admin from accounting anymore. They were talking to the musician. They were talking to her. Clara gave them a small, tired smile and murmured a quiet, "Thank you," before navigating her way through the crowd. People reached out to touch her arm as she passed, not in a grabby, intrusive way, but with a gentle, fleeting connection like touching a holy relic. She walked past the buffet table, past the abandoned dance floor, and towards the main doors. She didn't look back. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The sudden quiet of the outside world was a shock after the emotional intensity of the hall. The city hummed with a distant, gentle noise, and a cool breeze brushed against her hot face. She took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the clean, fresh air. She was alone, But as she stood there, looking up at the vast, star-dusted sky, she knew she wasn't the same person who had walked into that party a few hours ago. The quiet girl was still there, but she was no longer hiding. She had played her song, and in doing so, had finally started to hear her own music again. The joke was over, but something serious and beautiful had just begun. The cool night air felt like a splash of water on her face, waking her from a strange and vivid dream. She stood on the sidewalk outside the event hall. The distant city sounds a gentle hum after the profound silence that had followed her music. The party was still going on inside, a muffled thump of bass signaling a return to normalcy, but Clara knew that for her, nothing would ever be normal again. She walked to the bus stop, her steps feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because a weight she had been carrying for 5 years had been lifted, but heavier with the new, unfamiliar weight of being seen. The ride home was a blur. She stared out the window at the passing lights, but she wasn't really seeing them. She was reliving it, the feel of the keys, the sound of the notes filling the air, the sea of stunned faces. She kept coming back to the look on David's face. It wasn't just shock. It was a kind of dawning horror. The look of a man who had accidentally cracked open a safe and found a universe inside where he expected to find nothing. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt exposed, like a butterfly that had been safely cocooned in its chrysalis only to have it torn open too soon. Its wings still damp and fragile. That night, sleep didn't come. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. There was a lingering fear, the old, familiar voice in her head that told her she had made a terrible mistake. They would laugh at her on Monday. They would whisper behind her back, "Did you see her?" Making a big drama out of nothing. But for the first time, there was another voice, a quieter, stronger one. It was the echo of her father's words, the memory of his pride. It was the sound of the applause, not as a judgment, but as a gift. When Monday morning arrived, the anxiety was a physical knot in her stomach. Getting ready for work felt like preparing for a battle. She put on her usual simple clothes, pulled her hair back in its neat, practical way, and looked at herself in the mirror. The same face looked back, but her eyes looked different. Tired, yes, but something else was there too. A flicker of light. A spark of the woman who had played a nocturne in a crowded room and brought it to a standstill. The bus ride to the office was tense. Every stop, the doors hissing open, made her jump. She rehearsed what she would say. A simple, "Good morning," and then straight to her desk. No eye contact. Head down. Pretend it never happened. It was the safe plan. The old plan, but when she walked through the office doors, she realized the old plan no longer existed. The normal morning chatter, the low hum of computers and coffee machines, was absent. The office was quiet, too quiet. As she walked towards her cubicle, every conversation stopped. Heads turned. But this time, the stares were different. There was no mockery in their eyes. There was no pity. There was a quiet, respectful curiosity. It was as if they were looking at a colleague who had suddenly revealed she was a secret astronaut, and they were all trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the incredible thing they had witnessed. She reached her desk, her heart pounding, and sat down. She turned on her computer, the familiar startup sound a small comfort in the unnerving silence. She was just about to start checking her emails, trying to disappear into her screen, when a shadow fell over her desk. She looked up to see the woman from the sales team, the one who had been standing with David. She was holding 2 cups of coffee. She placed one gently on Clara's desk. I didn't know how you take it," the woman said, her voice soft and a little shy. "So I just put a little milk in it. That was really something on Friday, truly." She gave Clara a small, genuine smile, then walked back to her desk, leaving Clara staring at the coffee cup as if it were an alien artifact. That was just the beginning. Throughout the day, people found small, quiet ways to connect with her. The quiet guy from IT stopped by to ask if she knew any jazz standards. The woman from payroll left a sticky note on her monitor that simply said, "You have a beautiful gift." It wasn't a fuss. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a steady, quiet stream of genuine appreciation that slowly began to dissolve the knot of anxiety in her stomach. They weren't just being polite. They had been moved. And they wanted her to know. Then, late in the afternoon, she saw him again. David was walking towards her desk, and for a moment the old fear returned. But he looked different. His shoulders weren't puffed out. His walk wasn't a strut. He looked hesitant, almost nervous. He stopped by her desk, holding a small, brightly colored piece of paper. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at his shoes. Finally, he looked up, and his eyes met hers. They were clear and full of a sincerity she had never seen before. "Listen," he said, his voice low, so only she could hear. "I know I was a jerk. I was an idiot. And there's no excuse." He took a breath. "But what you did, you shouldn't keep that to yourself. People need to hear it." He held out the flyer. "It was for an open mic night at a small coffee shop downtown." "You don't have to," he said quickly. "I mean, I get it if you tell me to get lost. But I thought you should have the option." Clara looked at the flyer, then back at him. She saw no trace of the loud jokester who had put her on the spot. She just saw a man who was trying, in his own clumsy way, to make things right. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was offering an opportunity. A bridge! She thought about the dusty piano in the corner, the 5 years of silence, the sound of her father's laughter. She thought about the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the way the music had flowed through her, cleansing her. She reached out and took the flyer from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, and for a second, they both just stood there. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. A look of pure, unadulterated relief washed over David's face. He gave her a short, sharp nod, as if to say, "You got this," and then walked away, leaving her alone with the brightly colored paper. That evening, Clara didn't go straight home. She found herself walking towards a part of the city she didn't know well, drawn by a sound. It was a piano, coming from a small music shop that was still open. She stood in the doorway for a long time, just listening. Then she walked in. The shop owner, an old man with kind eyes, smiled and nodded towards a sleek black piano in the corner. "Help yourself," he said. Clara sat down on the bench. It was different from the old party piano, the keys cool and responsive under her touch. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, she played not for a crowd, not to prove a point, and not to exorcise a ghost. She played for herself. The notes that filled the small shop were not the stormy, passionate chords from the party, but something simpler. A gentle, hopeful melody. A new story. And as she played, a slow smile spread across her face. The joke was long over, and the serious, beautiful business of living had finally begun.